Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Bible study for the 2nd of June of 2021. My name is Pastor James Merriam. I'm one of the ministers at the United Church of Newport. Welcome to this time of devotion, of reflection, of contemplation, and of focus on a piece of scripture that's a little longer than we would quite often study on a Sunday morning, and a little bit more complicated and difficult than we might study on a Sunday morning. I've also really enjoyed taking this opportunity to dive into pieces of scripture, especially from the Old Testament, where we are further removed from the context, and many of us really are less familiar with the Old Testament. The project of the Revised Common Lectionary was really of the lectionary of the cycle of scripture and the combination of scriptures from different parts that many churches use to broaden their diversity of scripture and of consideration. Was really a big part of it was to bring more Old Testament texts, to use Old Testament texts to put the works of Jesus and of his apostles and of his followers in more of their appropriate context. But of course, when we dive into the Old Testament, it's not just to put Jesus in the right context. This is not anticipating Jesus. This is the world that Jesus lived in and the buildings of the world that Jesus lived in. But not everything is in anticipation of Jesus, and especially the scripture that we're going to hear today is not about Jesus, most certainly not, and requires a lot of background and context to sort of understand and look at. It's actually a really, really cool piece of scripture, a really important piece of scripture in the narrative that's being told. We're going to be reading in a little bit from 1 Samuel, and that is included in my contemporary translation of the Old Testament by Robert Alter in the Prophets section. And we're still pretty early in the Prophets section. This is the middle of the three sections. Of course, Samuel comes after Judges, which comes after Joshua, which Joshua you could contend is really sort of more part of the Torah, is the conclusion of the story of the Exodus, is the coming of the people into the land. The book of Judges is the story of the people before the coming of the kings, before the monarchy, and Samuel, in its two books, is the story of the establishment of the monarchy. Of course, the two books of Samuel are really more about David, but there's a long tradition of naming books in Scripture, or of referring to books in Scripture by what's really on the first page, what's at the very beginning, what they begin with. And in this case, that's the story of Samuel. It's actually Samuel's birth. Samuel's birth begins the first Samuel. Samuel's dead long before the end of the books of Samuel, and the main character becomes David, because of course Samuel is the leader of Israel and the prophet by whom David is found eventually, but we are well before that point in the story. We are way, way before that point in the story, to the point that David isn't even born yet at this point. David is just from a family that's noteworthy, but certainly far from the significance that it will eventually hold. So we're not talking about David, we're talking about Samuel. We're in chapter 8 of the book of Samuel, and really we've finally rejoined the narrative, the main sort of global narrative of the people of Israel, of the nation of Israel, not yet the kingdom, that concluded, or that was paused at the end of the book of Judges. Now, in our scripture, in our Bible, as it's normally laid out, in between Judges and Samuel would be the book of Ruth, which is included because of the time frame, because Ruth is specifically mentioned as having occurred right at the beginning during a famine during the time of the Judges. So it's put in there for the chronology, for an idea of the chronology, but it breaks. It's a separate story. It's a separate story about faith and about family that's inserted into what is otherwise mostly a historical narrative. Of course, also, we're in chapter 8 of Samuel. There have been 7 chapters before, which are mostly about Samuel specifically, but at the very beginning, it's about Samuel's mother, Hannah, and the song of Hannah, and Hannah's being barren. Hannah praying to have children, even though she's at an advanced age, and that prayer being answered. She then gives praise to God for the wonderful thing that has occurred. This is, of course, both an echo of Sarah, much earlier, who became pregnant at a very advanced age by miraculous means, and a prelude to Mary. Not because she became pregnant by miraculous means so much, but because but Mary sings a very similar song that's an echo back to the Song of Hannah. So we have that also as an interlude. So in our scripture, we've had both the interlude of the book of Ruth and the Song of Hannah, and now we come back with chapter 8 to Samuel, to the sort of governance once again, which was the governance and the story of Israel's struggles with its neighbors, of the new nation becoming established, and of the debate over how things should be run. Now the book of Judges, of course, concludes with, in that time there was no king in Israel, every man did what he thought was right. And whether this is a good thing or a bad thing is the subject of much debate. But if you take it as in a narrative, going from that at the end of Judges now to the next actual statement in that debate, finally coming back around after all of Ruth and the first 7 chapters of Samuel that are really about other things, setting up the characters who will continue that debate, because the book of Judges has very few long-running characters. It's more about this tribe and that tribe did one thing or another, and there are a few significant, including Deborah, the prophetess, and the judge, who was a female leader in Israel. So we've come back around and we've finally rejoined that conversation, that debate. So, at the beginning of chapter 8, and we're just going to read the entirety of chapter 8. There are some difficult names and locations that can kind of muddle this in terms of what's normally extracted, so most often in the lectionary we don't read the entire chapter. But 1 Samuel chapter 8. And it happened when Samuel grew old that he set his sons up as judges for Israel. And in the name of his firstborn son, and the name of his firstborn son was Joel, and the name of his secondborn was Abijah, judges in Beersheba. But his sons did not go in his ways, and they were bent on gain, and took bribes, and twisted justice. And all the elders of Israel assembled and came to Samuel at Ramah, and they said to him, "Look, you yourself have grown old, and your sons have not gone in your ways. So now set over us a king to rule us like all the nations." And the thing was evil in Samuel's eyes when they said, "Give us a king to rule us." And Samuel prayed to the Lord. And the Lord said to Samuel, "Heed the voices of the people in all that they say to you. For it is not you they have cast aside, but me. They have cast aside from reigning over them. Like all the deeds they have done from the day I brought them up from Egypt to this day, forsaking me and serving other gods, even so they do as well to you. So now heed their voice, and though you must solemnly warn them and tell them the practice of the kings that will reign over them." And Samuel said all the words of the Lord to the people who were asking of him a king. And he said, "This will be the practice of the king who will reign over you. Your sons he will take and set for himself in his chariots and in his cavalry, and some will run before his chariots. He will set for himself captains of thousands and captains of 50s to plow his ground and reap his harvest, and to make his implements of war and the implements of his chariots. And your daughters he will take as confectioners and cooks and bakers, and your best fields and your vineyards and your olive trees he will take and give to his servants. And your seed crops and your vineyards he will tithe and give to his eunuchs and to his servants. And your best male and female slaves and your cattle and your donkeys he will take and use for his tasks. Your flocks he will tithe. And as for you, you will become his slaves. And he will cry out that day before your king whom you choose for yourselves, and the Lord will not answer you on that day." And the people refused to heed Samuel's voice, and they said, "No, a king there shall be over us, and we too will be like the nations, like all the nations, and sally forth before us and fight our battles." And Samuel listened to all the words of the people, and he spoke them in the Lord's hearing. And the Lord said to Samuel, "Heed their voice and make them a king." And Samuel said to the men of Israel, "Go every man to his town." So now there's quite a long series after that in the next chapter that comes around to eventually the selection of Saul as king. Saul is a great warrior. Saul is very tall, is what he's named as being specifically what makes him worthy as being a king. But it is very much a warlike sort of a task. So this is some crazy and very, very interesting, and seems very out of place with all the conversation about kings and kingdoms and kingships and the books of the kings and the longing for the times of the kings and the restoration of the kings, and just all the debate that comes afterwards. But before this point, there were no kings. There was nothing like a king. No position was anything like a king. And specifically, even the having positions of power and authority passed down through lineage from father to son, or even father to daughter, or mother to son, or anything like that, none of those, that was really very much frowned upon. We have a curious repetition of what happens just a few chapters earlier, but many years earlier, because Samuel, as a child, was an attendant and a helper for the prophet Eli, and Eli's sons were, in the same way Samuel's sons now are, not doing a good job as judges over Israel, and Samuel is inspired by God to take that role, and Eli is the bigger person, and does a remarkable thing to not try to cling on to power in the face of Samuel coming up, and not try to cling on to power for the sake of his sons, and instead Samuel comes into this ad hoc sort of role of leadership that we have taken in English and has been passed down as the judge or the judgeship. It's not super similar to what we would call a judge today. It is significantly a military leader, and it's not a permanent installation, but kind of things were always coming up, and this ad hoc leader and director and judge in the fact of arbitrating between debates, because of course you have a divine law that's been handed down, so you don't need a legislature, you don't need to write law because God writes law. But there are always debates about one particular element, or how this particular situation pans out, or just debates about property ownership, or all the things that we have our different kinds of courts for. So you do need a judicial aspect. So really, maybe that's why it's what they were mostly doing, laying out God's justice, and that's what this is really talking about, or that's what this starts out talking about. We should really make very clear, and really in Hebrew it's much more clear, used because of the use of the words that are sort of used repetitively in a way that really has to be called a pun, about justice, about judgment, about the role of a king versus a judge, that includes this common judging, which is really is more like just continuation of traditions, which is just practice, that the judge or the king must be consistent. So that's where the sort of scales of justice and the blindfold over the allegory of justice, that the king or the judge, that justice is consistent, and that's the first and foremost thing that is looked for. So Samuel's sons start to step into this role, again breaking the precedent of never trying to set up a dynasty, really continuing the idea that dynasties are evil in God's sight and in practice, actually, and instead of things being even, they are twisted, they are uneven, they are bent. And it says they were bent on gain, and that's not an English turn of phrase. That's in the original Hebrew, that it's they're twisted from the even practices, and they took bribes and twisted justice. So that's a repetition of the same word in Hebrew, trying to be recreated in English, but not quite right, because being twisted on gain is not an expression, but being bent on gain is an expression in English. So, but it's the same concept. It's just things are not straight and narrow and even and balanced like the scales. So we have this meeting. We have this almost constitutional convention. We have this convention, this gathering of the elders for a decision of great significance, really because a judge was both for sort of the small, minor decisions and the constant bickering, settling the debates of the constant bickering that any group of people getting together will inevitably result in. So one person is set aside who will be even. And then this is actually curious that we have two sons. That to go back a little bit, there are some confusing place names, but it says that the two sons Joel and Abijah were judges in Beersheba. This is only in one version of in the Old Testament. There's another version where one son goes north and one son goes south, so it's sort of a prelude to the divided north-south kingdom split that would eventually emerge. It doesn't make a lot of sense because Samuel lived in the north. Beersheba is quite far in the south. Why his two sons would be judging all of Israel or splitting Israel, but both be in the south, is maybe a later tradition. Maybe something like a place name was a reference to one of them, and that's what's being referenced here. It's not necessarily really a direct historical thing or really that important to what comes after, because the sons basically disappear from the story completely after that one mention. So the elders assemble, they have this convention, they have this direction of what's to come along. They start out wanting to talk about justice, but it becomes very clear, and really the entire rest of the story, the entire rest of this reading, the entire rest of this debate is not about justice, it's about military success. Jumping forward near the end, there's specifically that it says, after Samuel has made this whole argument against all the wickedness and evil of kings, and of having a king, the assembly of the elders cries out, "No!" Instead, they did not listen, they did not heed, or they did not take in or understand what Samuel was saying. And they said, "No, a king there shall be over us, and we too will be like all the nations, and the king shall rule and sally forth before us and fight our battles." So sally forth is sort of is an English expression for coming out of your fortress to fight a battle, but the Hebrew is more like he will be always going in and coming out, which really just means he will be leading in the battle. So we're focused intensely on heroic leadership at the front of the battle, and of somebody who's elevated to the point and wealthy to the point that they can bring in this new technology that is coming to dominate the battlefield, and that Israel does not have in its battles with others, of chariots. So we have this whole conversation about chariots, that we need to centralize the means of military organization and production because we need chariots. This has happened then, it happened before this, it's happened all the way up to the present day. Huge amounts of money have been poured into the single, central, biggest and most significant aspect of the military. During the mid-20th century, that was nuclear weapons. During the late 19th century and early 20th century, it was battleships. Huge amounts of money were poured into battleships. Before that, it was wooden fighting ships, big cannons, big catapults, going all the way back. There've always been big things that no individual would ever have at their own home or be able to bring out. When you call up sort of the militia army of regular people joining the army, you need to have an organized standing army, and you need to have somebody with enough power and enough central authority to bring enough money together at once to create and maintain these big, powerful war machines. They're thinking of this as leading the battle, but really the vast majority of what these things do is they're a deterrent. That if the king, they have this imagination that if the king of Israel is riding around in a chariot and inspecting the frontiers in a chariot or with many chariots, the neighbors and possible enemies of Israel will think twice, because they see and know that there's something serious going on. And everyone loves the grandeur of a parade like that. Chariots are dramatic, chariots are remarkable. Chariots actually, really to almost the present day, have become this, long after they became obsolete on the battlefield, became this symbol of power. Notably things like on the top of the Brandenburg Gate in Berlin, that was the symbol of the divide between East and West during the Cold War, has a quadriga, a 4-horse chariot, which is a sign of conquest on the top of it in this great dramatic position. The gate, this enormous structure, is just built to lift up and show this conquering dramatic chariot, which the symbol still remains, and that's only about from 150 years ago that was built, or so. Still pretty recent. So chariots, even in the recent past, significant. But then, at this point, we're talking about actual cutting-edge military technology, though it's maybe getting towards the end of the chariot period in history. And Samuel points out correctly that in order to have chariots, it takes a lot of money. And in that time, you don't have a lot of currency, particularly. You mostly have sort of a barter system. Most people grow food or have livestock. It's going to mean that the king will use by force, take what he needs to create this standing army and to maintain this standing army, in the form of taxes, in the form of what's used as tithes, which is taking 1/10 of what you produce, which is the tradition of what we give to the church now. But then it's an expression. This is taxes. This is forced taxation. This is a part of the fact of what you need to do in order to maintain a standing army like this. It's just a fact that apparently the elders of Israel haven't thought about. They just want the chariot. They just want the focal point. In order to have the chariot, you need a king. So it's sort of, there's even in the phrasing that it says, the people say, no, a king there shall be over us, while Samuel says, the king you choose for yourself. So that's when we jump back very briefly to this debate over God making direct decisions for the nation, that Samuel is like, you're replacing the leadership of God in the community with this king that will be your king, not God's king, will be very much your king. While the people say, no, this is separate from sort of the governance of God. When you come really right down to it, this is the king, the military commander who will bring us glory and bring us wealth through conquest. And Samuel points out that what we conquer, what we take, this so-called like easy way to accumulate wealth by being victorious in battle, means you have to take from others, and you also have to take from yourselves to assemble this standing army. This is put forward and is often titled the argument against kingship, but perhaps it should be more accurately titled, because everything about both what Samuel is using as an argument against establishing a king and what the elders of Israel are using as an argument for establishing a king is actually about having a standing army. So all of this, that people will be forced to do all these things in the service of the army, and then even worse than that, and we know this is a common thread basically throughout Scripture, throughout the Judeo-Christian tradition, and really through all other traditions, that it's not so much the king that's the problem. It's the king's servants. It's the court. And it's not servants as in like the people who bring him his food. It's his bureaucrats. That every bureaucrat will be trying to skim just a little bit more than they're entitled to off the top. And that will build, and there'll be court intrigue, and there'll be fighting among the bureaucrats. They'll turn against one another. And all of this that doesn't add anything to the nation, doesn't produce any wealth, doesn't produce anything, actually drains the wealth of the nation. So the focal point is, and the heart of Samuel's argument is, and your seed crops and your vineyards he will tithe and give to his eunuchs and his servants. Give to the foreigners, the fancy, weird foreigners is just what eunuchs means in this situation, and his servants, which means his bureaucrats, which means his organizational leaders, because he needs to be sure that he has enough for the army, and he needs to hire people and pay them and give them power to enforce the needs of the standing army, to have the chariots, to win the battles. And this is just an invitation for abuse. Just the broadest of invitation. First small abuses, and then bigger and bigger abuses, until the people are themselves like slaves. And Samuel says, this is what's going to happen. This is what inevitably is going to happen. Now, some interpreters of this have suggested that this is a later, this whole section is later addition in light of the wickedness of some of the kings that come after Solomon. The descendants of Solomon are supplanted and others become kings, especially in the northern kingdom of Israel. So versus the southern kingdom of Judah, and they're wicked and they're abusive and they steal, and it's a terrible situation. But no, you have Canaanite kings, you have as they say, almost every other nation in the world, all of the surrounding areas beyond Israel have exactly this going on. The normal people are not free. The normal people do not have the luxury of doing what they think is right, or the men, the ordinary men and elders of the nation. They are subservient to the king, and especially to the king's servants, to the king's bureaucrats. And so it's an emphatic argument against. It sort of parallels Dwight Eisenhower's famous 1960 speech about the military-industrial complex. It's an emphatic argument against standing armies and the wickedness that they inevitably result in. It's an argument against kingship because that's just very clearly associated with standing armies, associated with conquest. And then even down to the idea that, like, once you have the standing army, you're paying all this money for it, you should use it. Like, don't waste all this money just on an army that does nothing. The greatest use of an army like this is deterrent, to keep others from attacking you, but you can't see the results of deterrent, because the results of an appropriate deterrent is that nothing happens. So it feels like waste. And if it's so easy to just go and conquer a little bit and make some wealth out of this very expensive thing you've put together, it just inevitably sort of happens. So you have multiple ways this is going to spiral out of control. The more army, the more war. The more army, the more bureaucrats. The more uneven layering of justice, the more cheating, the more stealing, the more twisting, which is ostensibly what we've started out with. That we're trying to avoid the twisting of justice by creating a system that will twist justice more, because of the distraction of that thing at the front, without an idea of everything that comes behind and is necessary to build and support that one piece right at the front. That's kind of still true. You have a huge structure in any kind of an organization that supports putting the one spear point right in the midst of battle, or right in the organization, or whatever. Things like in any corporation, the people who actually interact with customers are a very limited number, and there's a huge amount of support behind that, to both to do the work, and then provide, and then move the stuff that you need to do the work, and then make the stuff that you need to do the work, and organize and support and keep all of that running smoothly. But what you actually see is just the spear point, is just the chariot in this case. And of course Samuel was right. Of course Samuel was wise. Of course the chapters that come after show Samuel being absolutely correct. And it takes a really extraordinary person in David, and then a further extraordinary person in Solomon, to judge wisely and rule well and be a great conqueror for the nation without, and with a few exceptions, since they both committed horrible errors and were abusive in their own way. Samuel was right. Samuel was absolutely right. And it's emphatic, and this is God speaking, and this doesn't claim to be twisted by any prophet, but God opposes kings. Straight up. So it's incredible that for thousands of years, the divine right of kings was a central tenet of Christianity. It's incredible. And that was until very recently. Very, very recently. It was an absolute, inarguable, and uncontestable rule, despite how clear, how emphatic, how unambiguous the opposition of God to kings is, in this section and in other sections. But that's a topic for another day. This has been Bible study for the 2nd of June, 2021. I'm Pastor James. Take care, and we'll see you again soon. God bless.